It's a great honor for me to introduce Mike Whinston. 40 years ago, in 1984, Mike Whinston obtained a PhD in economics from MIT and began his career as an assistant professor of economics at Harvard University. Currently, he serves as the Sloan Fellows Professor of Management at MIT Sloan and Professor of Economics in the MIT Economics Department. He's an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science and a fellow of the Econometric Society. Mike Whinston has made significant contributions in a number of topics in micro contract and organization, law and economics, and more recently, health economics. So given the breadth of his work, it's impossible for me to do justice to all his major contribution in a short time. Hence, I will talk about some of his contributions. So his theoretical work with Douglas Bernheim on common agents and manual auctions has been extremely influential and widely applied by researchers in different fields such as international trade, environment, industrial organization, and political economy. In industrial organization, his work on foreclosure and exclusive contracts has had an immense impact. For instance, his seminal AR paper on tying resurrected the leverage theory of tying against the Chicago School's criticism by developing a formal model which shows how tying could be used to exclude competitors. He told us that he got the motivation for the paper from the Antistrust law class he took from Harvard Law School. He has also opened a new horizon in merger theory by writing a series of influential papers co-authored with Falkenok. For instance, the recent AR paper on concentration thresholds for horizontal mergers has attracted considerable attention in a very short time. His research is marked by a combination of theoretical rigor and empirical relevance, evidenced by a number of recent empirical papers. For instance, he received a 2016 Frisch Medal for his econometrica paper on microeconomic theory with Mascolel and Green has become the standard graduate level textbook and has educated generations of economists. In 2024, 40 years after obtaining his PhD, Michael received two great news. First, the Department of Justice won the landmark Google case in which Mike Whinston played a decisive role as an expert witness for the DOJ by explaining the market definition and the harm from Google's conduct. Second, Mike will receive the Jean-jacques Laffont Prize today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doh-Shin, and thank you, Colette, as well. And it's an honor and a really pleasure to be here. It's been a little too long, I have to say. But I'd say I've been here this week and gotten what I'd describe as a fire hose of TSE. And it's pretty nice drink, I have to say. So that's been really great. I'm glad, it's great to be here. So I'm going to talk about economic theory, empirics, and the accessible. That's my aim. The very end of it might be a little bit less so, but I kind of put it at the end. So anyway, okay, so let me get started. So there's been a lot of recent attention to antitrust, a lot of concerns both in the US and around the world about monopolization, especially large tech platforms, but otherwise, with other businesses. So here's just a collection of different cases, all but the one on the bottom right, headlines about the US with Google, Apple, and Amazon and other cases. So the one that oops. Okay, I'll point at it. That Doh-Shin mentioned, the Google search case, I did had the opportunity. Yeah, the piece of good news in August that we won, and now the actually the remedies process and decision process has just started. There's also, just as a measure of how much is going on, the Department of Justice also has a case against Google for ad tech. I'll talk briefly about that a little bit later. The testimony in that trial just ended really about a week ago. As well, Epic Games, the game maker, had a case against Google and Apple. In case of Google, the judge just announced remedies literally 2 days ago. Okay. Now, these are US cases, important to recognize Europe really did lead the way on these cases. So here I have Amazon. Obviously, there have been a number of cases involving Google and others in Europe. It's not just monopolization that's been very active as a focus and a concern, but also merger policy, a concern that perhaps merger policy, at least this is in the US, has not been as stringent as perhaps would be ideal. So that's been a focus as well. So, oops, a measure of this, I don't know, do you guys get John Oliver? Okay, so John Oliver, late night, a comedian, late night show, like a measure of how much attention all of these things is getting is John Oliver actually had a whole segment that he did on mergers. I'm not going to play it here for two reasons. One, we don't have a lot of time, but I definitely recommend it. It's remarkably good and insightful, actually. He did a great job. The other reason I'm not going to play it is it's pretty dirty. Okay, so like pretty inappropriate for this audience. But you might have fun with it at home. Okay, so what's the goal of the lecture? The goal of the lecture, I'm going to discuss some areas in which theory and empirical work have had important influences on how we think about antitrust. As well, I'm also, as we get towards the end, going to highlight at least a couple of places where, work, I think there's really areas where continued work, issues that really could use continued work. Actually, there are many such issues, but I'll just talk briefly about a couple of them. Okay, so when I do talk about various areas, they come across a range of parts of antitrust. And I generally think of antitrust as divided into two areas. One are laws having to do with what you might call collusion. And by that, I mean in a broad sense, that is relaxing competition among rivals. And so obviously price fixing, where we get together and explicitly agree on prices, where competitors do that, is collusion. But more broadly, horizontal mergers are really about the same thing. Are we going to, a merger's a very extreme form of getting together to agree on what we're going to do and can relax price competition. The other part of antitrust is exclusion, which has to do with excluding rivals. So various practices, predation, exclusive dealing, tying, vertical mergers, kind of are examples of things that fall into that category. And I'll be talking about a number of them today. Okay, so my first example will be about theory and about exclusion and the ways in which theory has shed light on exclusionary conduct and how to think about exclusionary conduct. And this will relate some to what some of the things that Doh-Shin mentioned. So what are the types of exclusionary conduct? There are many. I just listed 4. 3 of which are kind of the primary, the biggest areas that attract attention. So one is exclusive dealing. So exclusive dealing are contracts where one party agrees not to deal with any other parties than the counterparty in the agreement. So the concern is that that contract may deny rivals access to critical inputs or distribution and reduce their competitiveness. So Google search case was an exclusive dealing case. It was about contracts that Google wrote, with Apple to be the default in Safari, the exclusive default with Android makers, and that kept rivals from having access to consumers. Another or existing combinations in the case of refusals to deal of firms at different levels of the vertical structure. And the concern there is that vertically integrated firm may not buy or sell from non-integrated rivals, reducing those rivals' competitiveness. Examples, the EU Google shopping case where there's the allegation was about self-preferencing, on Google search results page. In the US, there was the first vertical merger case brought in decades was AT&T Time Warner. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Government lost that case, in fact, but that was a case, a vertical merger case. Right now, DOJ is suing Live Nation and Ticketmaster. Live Nation is the dominant concert promoter in the US. Ticketmaster is the dominant. And so actually the government's trying to break them back up. Okay. Lastly, tying, which Doh-Shin mentioned briefly. Tying is a requirement that a buyer of product I either not purchase product J from the seller of I, that would be a tie-in or bundling, or agree not to purchase from rivals this other product. And the concern there is that a firm that has market power in one one product, say A, might, quote, leverage that market power to gain monopoly power in B, where it faces rivals. An example of that would be the US ad tech case against Google that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. So let me just, to give you an example, just one concrete example, and so you have a sense of what's going on in that case. This is a picture of the ad tech, Tech are tools that enable publishers who have spots on their web pages to sell ads, display ads on those web pages. And ad tech are the tools that enable those to be sold to advertisers, okay, in real time. So when you hit a web page, publishers sometimes pre-sell those ads, but the ads that aren't pre-sold, they will actually put into an auction that happens in milliseconds, okay? And that when you see the things that has been, the ad that's served on the web page, that has actually been auctioned off in that time. Okay, so you have publishers on one end, and so this whole thing gets called the ad tech stack, and it's a combination of several different tools. There's publishers, sellers on the left there. On the right are the advertisers who are interested in buying those ads, okay? And then there's several different pieces of this ad tech stack, and what's shown in big parts here are Google's pieces. So DFP is what's called a publisher ad server. What that does is it manages the inventory. People, some of the inventory is pre-sold, other parts of the inventory goes into these auctions, and the ad server's deciding which one, to maximize the publisher's revenue, is deciding which one to do when you hit a web page. On the other end are bidding tools that advertisers use. Big advertisers so in the case of Google, it's called Google Ads. It used to be called AdWords. They keep changing the term. But big publishers use other tools, actually other bidding tools. Google Ads is what small advertisers use for buying search ads and buying digital display ads. Basically, buy ads on, through Google Ads, and they also buy ads on Facebook, and that's kind of what they do. And so Google Ads has a lot of potential market power over those small advertisers. And in the middle is what's called an ad exchange. It's actually the product that is running the auction. Okay, so what Google has done here, and the accusation in the whole case is that they've basically used DFP. So in this whole, their ad tech stack was basically put together by acquisition. So they bought DoubleClick, which owned an ad server, now called still called DoubleClick for publishers, DFP, and Google Ads. So they didn't own Google Ads before, but they basically bought case in many ways, which is that both DFP and Google Ads basically disadvantage rivals and advantage AdX. So up at the top, you'll see rival publisher, rival exchanges, and those arrows basically are things that Google doesn't do. So Google Ads essentially, not 100%, essentially doesn't, all of its ads go to AdX. And the reason it can weaken rival exchanges is that scale matters for ad exchanges. Thickness of the market matters. Okay, so this is just an example, and also when you read about ad tech case, I think Europe actually now also has recently started to look at ad tech. You'll have an idea what it is. Okay. All right. So all three of these kind of exclusionary vertical practices had the similar intellectual history, okay, which Doh-Shin also briefly mentioned. So from 1900 to about 1960, maybe a little bit before, there was a very long-standing concern, and I'm speaking now of the US courts, over these practices, that they would serve as ways to monopolize. And then starting in the late 50s, early 1960s, the Chicago School came along and basically intellectually seemed to demolish those concerns. And basically the way they did it was with theoretical arguments, okay? Basically, they said, in each case, here's a really simple model in which it doesn't make any logical sense what the concerns are. And number two, then we demolished it. Now we'll say like, oh, why does it happen? Other pro-competitive reasons, okay? And I think, one of the things that really, this history, I find the thing is that like the Chicago School had theoretical models and the courts, they didn't. And those theoretical models really influenced how people thought. That it seemed like, the Chicago School had a way of thinking that the people who were just qualitatively thinking about these things couldn't match, okay? Then in 1980s and 90s, along came game theory. Jean was a huge, important force in that. And that game theoretical work really showed that anti-competitive exclusionary behavior actually can make sense strategically. And that kind of has revived all of that. Those concerns of the court weren't crazy. They weren't illogical. The simple models that were being used by the Chicago School didn't capture them. And more recently, it's still too little to be empirical work looking at some of these things. So let me talk about this theory a little more. So the example I'll give you is tying, which is what Doh-Shin mentioned. So what's the Chicago School critique? Suppose you have independent products, two of them. This is the one little part of math until we get to the end. So A and B, and consumers value A at VA and B at VB, and they want 1 unit of each. And the costs of producing them are CA and CB. There's a monopolist of A, but market B is competitive. And the Chicago School asked, well, could it be that the monopolist would find it useful to bundle them together, tie them together, and take over market B? So what was the argument? Well, first, suppose there's independent pricing, no tying, okay? Well, the monopolist will charge for A, the value, VA, and for B, it faces competition, so it's going to set a price equal to cost, okay? Competition is going to force it to set a price of cost. What's the profit going to be? Well, it's only going to make a profit in market A, VA minus CA of selling to that consumer. Well, what about with tying? Well, suppose the monopolist only offers the bundle A and B together. It's going to it's going to force everybody to, if they want A, they have to buy B from the monopolist. Okay. Well, what's the most they can charge for the combination? Well, the most they can charge is the amount is given by the amount P that makes the consumers indifferent between buying the bundle and buying just B and forgetting about A. So that, if you buy just B, you get the value of B minus the price, which is CB. That's the competitive price. If you buy the bundle, you get your value of the bundle, VA plus VB, but you have to pay this price P. So the most the monopolist can charge is VA plus CB. Okay? What's the profit from that? Well, the profit from that is that price, VA plus CB, minus the total cost of the bundle. And lo and behold, it's exactly the same as independent pricing. There's no gain at all from this monopolist. The monopolist can force anyone who buys A to buy B, but not profitably. Okay? So the Chicago lesson was, aha, there's only one monopoly profit to be had. You were a monopolist in A, you're still, that's all you've got. And you're not going to do any better than that by bundling. Okay? All right. So the paper that Doh-Shin was referring to, like in 1990, the basic thing about that Chicago argument was it was like a super simple model where you actually never were able to influence market B, and you never had any ability to affect that. And so that paper that Doh-Shin talked about, I'll be quick here, that paper that Doh-Shin talked about was basically making the point that if instead competition for B in that market for B was one where it was oligopolistic, there were scale economies, then by committing to this bundle, it would make the monopolist gain sales in market B, take scale away from those market B competitors, and they, as a result, might, wouldn't be as profitable. And in that paper, the extreme version was they would exit more generally. And so you actually would be able to successfully monopolize that market. Okay. And so that's, that was an example of what I just talked about a moment ago, like with a game theoretic model, you actually could see that strategically it could make sense. All right. One thing about that paper was that it really focused on a case where you did technological bundling, kind of like you built your product and committed to selling the two things as one thing. And there were many interesting papers that came along since that paper of mine, and that extended the ways in which that idea could be used and introduced others. But they tended to, for the most part, all still stick to that commitment assumption that things were technologically bundled. And I think one of the issues with that still was sort of kind of an issue is like a lot of tying cases that you read about, they're not technological ties. They actually are contractual. Someone is just saying, if you're going to buy my A, I'm only going to sell you B. So Google has a contract called the MADA, the Mobile Application Distribution Agreement, with Android manufacturers, where what it says is if you want the Play Store, you're going to have to give us, our search product, the placement on the home screen, and basically preference, give us an exclusive on the home screen for on Android phones. So in a sense, it's tying access to the Play Store, to get to search preferencing, to basically giving Google that home screen. And you might ask, well, what's the difference between paying, what if Google had just paid for that home screen placement versus using the Play Store? Is it different? Does it matter? Should we just think of the Play Store as paying, like it actually is looking at that and showing, in the case where, at least where there are network externalities in market B, that you can actually, that using the Play Store can be valuable. And it can be valuable because when you're a monopolist in do I get looking at the clock to whether to do things? Okay, because the mayor will be waiting. So I had a nice little slide, but the key, I'll go quickly here. I'm not gonna, it would, in a simple two-buyer, simple case in market A, there can be, when you price separately the products, there can be unexploited surplus, okay? And so like if you were just charging, if you charged for the Play Store and then also were paying for, that placement, some of the distributors would have a big surplus. And you can, by tying, you can basically use that. You get them to give you the placement on their phones. And the thing is, once you get some people, if it's network if it's a network industry in market B, if you get some people on board that, then others will follow. And so you can kind of use the Play Store to take over the market or use your monopoly to take over the market, even though you're not committing. So that was a little quick, but I want to make sure I don't end up keeping you late. Okay. All right. So I turned our paper into these nice pictures, and now I'm not even getting to do it. So, okay. Okay. So let me talk about horizontal mergers a little bit. Yeah, 20 minutes. 15 really. So for horizontal mergers, this is another place where economics has been really influential. And in this case, I'll just briefly talk about empirics, not theory. So, empirical work in having to do with horizontal mergers has done two things that are really important. At least two things. One is it's shed light, it's looked at retrospectively at mergers that have happened and looked at what the price effects have been. Have they been good for consumers or have they been bad for consumers? Okay. The second thing that empirical work has done is, and a little bit theory and some theory too, is give methods for predicting changes, price changes that would come from mergers. So for example, for price effects, there have been quite a number of papers that you would call a merger retrospective, where people have looked at existing mergers, looked at what the price effects, how they've affected prices, and what they've generally found is very often prices go up. These mergers, in the case of a horizontal merger, it reduces competition. The argument on the other side is, well, maybe it makes the firms more efficient, and that's good for consumers. So it's always like a balancing act. And if you watch actually that John Oliver video, he gets that incredible. He gets it totally right. Okay. He has a little picture of a scale and he's weighing in between the dirty jokes. Okay. So, but generally what those papers have found is the scale often tips one way, which is that whatever efficiencies there are don't counterbalance the loss of competition, and consumers are worse off. The other thing that empirical work has done is come up with a method of merger simulation. So if you estimate, the fundamentals of the market, costs, demand, you can actually use a model and using, models of Nash equilibrium to predict, well, if you combine these firms, how much of a price effect is there likely to be? Okay, or how significant will that be? And so Aviv Nevo, Jerry Hausman, and Zona have a paper doing this. As well, there are kind of simpler methods called upward pricing pressure that Farrell and Shapiro have come up with. And the basic idea of this, all of it, is when two firms that are substitutes merge, they internalize once they've merged, they internalize the effect that being aggressive in pricing has on the rival. So like I once testified in a merger case back in 2015, and one of the things I was explaining to the judge is like, that undercuts the other firm and steals business is a massive hero, okay? But the day after the merger, they're not a hero anymore. They're the firm that stole business away from their new division, okay? And that difference is really important, okay, for how aggressive the firms will be after a merger. More recently, there's been some work on looking at non-price effects that can happen. I actually gave a project, talked about a project on banking the other day, on Tuesday, that was about this. So empirical work can really, really inform our ability to learn whether mergers are likely to be good or bad, and also to predict which mergers are likely to be good or bad, which has enormous, implications for how we treat is exclusionary practices. So, okay. Here are just two examples. I mentioned a few minutes ago that they're starting, when we got to the bottom of that history slide, I said, well, there's kind of starting to be work on these issues. They're, on exclusionary issues, empirical work. It's still much less than would be ideal. One of the things in what's interesting in economics is that, there are incredibly strong views about exclusionary practices where people have very different views about whether they, they're real things that are likely to happen or not likely to happen. And I think one of the reasons is we have too little evidence. And of course, macro, I'm going to making them. So maybe having more evidence, won't fully eliminate those different views, but I'm hopeful it will at least help. Okay, so on the left is a paper. One example is a paper that Greg Crawford, Robin Lee, and Lee Uruglu, I wrote with them about the cable industry. So it was a paper about regional sports networks, which are very, they show basically lots of regional sports networks in each city. There's basically a different regional sports network that shows the team of that city and their games. And as well, there are cable operators downstream. They're the distributors for that. And what we looked at is what's the effect of a merger between a regional sports network and one of the. And a good thing, some of you have studied vertical issues, have heard like you might eliminate double marginalization. So it may be that if you merge, that merged firm is going to price more efficiently, maybe be more likely to carry channels that consumers find valuable. But on the other hand, along the lines I talked about with vertical mergers and refusals to deal, they may entirely refuse to sell to rival distributors downstream of the merged firm. A satellite firm who's competing with the cable firm, or instead of doing that, they might just price more high at a higher price. They may, what they charge may be higher, disadvantaging those rivals downstream. So we looked at that, and else I talked about for horizontal mergers. In these vertical things, there's the same thing. It can be more efficient, but there can also be exclusion. And how does that horse race kind of turn out? So in the case of our paper, what we saw is that it really varied. It varied a lot by the circumstances of a city. Overall, if you looked at all the mergers we looked at, it was a net positive to have the vertical mergers, but there were places where it was definitely a negative. Another example, recent paper by Conlon and Mortimer that was in the Journal of Political Economy is about all units discounts. So all units discounts are price offers where once you offer say a distributor, once you have sold a certain amount, you're going to get a really big discount on everything that you just bought. And so it's kind of a version of an exclusive contract. It's not fully exclusive, but it pushes the distributors. An all-unit discount offered by the dominant candy manufacturer in the U.S., Mars. And that contracted it. First of all, I don't know if candy machines here, I haven't seen a candy machine here, but a candy machine in the US has 7 spots, key spots for chocolate. And so what Mars said is you have to give us 6 of them, or maybe it was 5. Okay. Plus, we're going to give you this big all units discount if you sell, depending how much you sell. And so they studied that, and the horse race there was that might incentivize the distributor to restock the candy machine more often in order to reach the threshold. So that could be a good thing. We don't have to go to the candy machine when we're hungry and see that there's nothing in it. On the other hand, it disadvantages rivals. And so that was the horse race that they were looking at. So there's some work. Having more papers that look at these vertical issues, exclusionary issues, would be fantastic. Okay, so now my remaining time, I'm going to shift gears a little. So everything I just did was talking about places where economics has had, things have been the successes, sort of, leaving aside my own work, have been the successes. Places where we've had, been able to do things that changed how what we knew about certain practices. So what I wanted, and also they've been about the work was really, really specifically about antitrust issues, like really kind of about the competition issues that happen. But, it's also true that more or what we can do looking at antitrust issues. Okay. So I want to just give a couple of examples of that. And that is true both for empirical work and for theory. And that'll be kind of the last thing I do. Okay. So 2 examples. These are 2 examples where more progress would help, but also that are foundational issues. They're not just about antitrust, but they would end up having implications for antitrust. Okay, so the first is about alternative models of contract formation. So all of these vertical issues that I talked about, they're all, for the most part, except for refusals to deal, they are contractual issues, exclusive dealing, tying. And applied work has often used, actually Pierre gave a paper today that did this, a version of what's called a Nash bargaining is a model of bargaining between 2 parties. The basic Nash model is between 2 parties where basically each party has a disagreement point, which is their payoff if there's no deal. Okay, and then Nash bargaining says you're going to reach an efficient an agreement that maximizes the joint payoff, but you're going to split the gains from trade. Okay, and according to the bargaining strength of each party. Nash and Nash says in a setting, in these oligopoly settings that come up in antitrust, there typically are many parties. Upstream, there might be a number of upstream sellers and a number of downstream distributors. What Nash and Nash does is it says, each pair is Nash bargaining and doing it, taking as given the agreements that everyone else is signing, that they're signing with everyone else. In the sense that we look for an overall equilibrium where everyone's bargain is optimal given what everyone else is doing. Okay. So there are some problems with Nash and Nash. Okay. It gets used a lot. I used it in that, we used it in that paper about regional sports networks. We did Nash and Nash. Okay. But there's some weaknesses of it. So one is the assumption that this agreement holds all of those other deals as given. Okay. And one of the things that does is it means that competition actually is kind of minimized. It's, in that, for example, it's, if, Doh-Shin and I are both having an agreement, are trying to reach an agreement with Jean, but Jean is, only in Nash and Nash, like when I negotiate with I make a deal with Jean where he just stops buying from Doh-Shin. I displace him. Okay, that's an important element of competition. And in the US, for example, health insurance companies, when they're dealing with negotiating with hospitals for their network that, in their insurance contracts, often what they'll do is they'll narrow their network so that they're not covering all the hospitals in a city. And on the one hand, that's not as great because people can't go to all the hospitals, but on the other hand, it gives them much more bargaining power. But Nash and Nash would miss that entirely. Because the reason it gives them more bargaining power is that, if there are 10 hospitals in the city, but they're only going to cover 8, it's exactly this competition for displacement. Okay. Second issue, it assumes complete information. Party and their preferences and their willingness to accept a deal. If you've ever tried to buy a car, okay, or anything, right? You're negotiating with your roommate. So there's been some recent works, and one of the implications of that actually is, any deal that is profitable should happen. And that isn't always the case, okay? And so there's been some work, Brad Larson has a paper that starts to look at bargaining with asymmetric information, but that hasn't really filtered into, any of these vertical models on antitrust. Okay. A third thing that's a limitation is Nash and Nash, basically this model where you split the gains from trade over the disagreement payoffs, the payoffs that won't happen, that you'll get if the deal doesn't happen. Often a disagreement point increases by $1 in the simplest version of Nash bargaining. Their payoff from the deal goes up by 50 cents, no matter where they started with their disagreement point. Okay, so here's an example where that assumption really might matter, whether that's true or not true. So I should say not all bargaining models have that feature. So there's work by Binmore, Shacken, and Sutton on what's called the outside option bargaining model, where if your disagreement payoff is way, way worse than the deal that would happen, it doesn't matter if you change it a little bit. Okay, it's just not, put it this way, it's not credible that you're ever going to want to take that, have a disagreement. And so in that model, it's quite different. Some it's good, doesn't matter. Okay, so let's go back. I mentioned that US AT&T case. Okay, and so it was AT&T and Time Warner were proposing a vertical merger. Time Warner owns CNN, so it makes content, and CNN is a very important channel in the US, cable channel. AT&T was a cable distributor, okay, or actually satellite distributor, but was a distributor of content. And then there were rival cable TV distributors, and the concern was very much like the model we had in the Regional Sports Network paper. The concern and the theory, Carl Shapiro was the expert in that case, and the theory that he put forward was involving disagreement points. In particular, once Time Warner and AT&T merge, suddenly Time Warner, when it's negotiating with other cable distributors, thinks to itself, well, if we don't reach a deal, those distributors aren't going to look so attractive to consumers, and a bunch of them are going to end up at my AT&T service because they're going to not be happy at the rivals. And that changes the disagreement point when the vertical merger happens and makes the price that's bargained for, go up. That was the theory. That, it might make Time Warner actually not even supply the rivals, but if they did supply it, they would supply it at a higher price. Okay? All right. As I mentioned earlier, the DOJ lost this case. The judge didn't, one of the key things was the judge did not believe this theory of bargaining. Okay? He didn't believe that a change in the disagreement point because of the vertical merger would change the terms on which one of the reasons was he thought, basically that you almost never see disagreement in this industry, okay? It happens occasionally for a few days, but then, they make up and they reach a deal. Now, there are two ways of interpreting that. One is something we know just doesn't make any sense, which is like things that don't happen don't matter. And actually things that don't happen can matter, right? That when you bargain, if you have a good position, even if it doesn't end up happening, it affects the deal you have, okay? The other, though, might be a more intelligent thing, which is maybe Shackett Sutton is right, and if it's like a really bad outcome, it doesn't matter if the vertical merger changes that payoff a little bit. So this is what the judge actually said, Judge Leon. Said the linchpin of Professor Shapiro's testimony is the assumption that a post-merger Turner would gain increased leverage by wielding a blackout threat that will only be somewhat less credible. This does not make sense as a matter of logic, and more importantly, has not been supported by sufficient real-world evidence. So, what's the lesson? How disagreement points matter can matter, okay? It can matter in the real world. And so, like, understanding something about this bargaining would be helpful. Okay, I'm about to run out of time. All right, so in fact, I have run out of time. So the other thing, I'll just say what the other thing was I was going to do. And anyone this is the thing that was going to be less accessible. And so I'm definitely not going to do it because we have like no time. But let me just say what it is. And the slides are here for anyone who's interested. So empirical work on vertical contracting has typically assumed contracts are very, very simple. Like in my paper on regional sports networks that I mentioned, it was just assumed, and actually in this case, it's actually pretty accurate, but that the price was just a simple per unit price. Like in the case of cable, it's like, how much do you pay per subscriber for the for the content, okay? But in a lot of settings, like the Conlon-Mortimer paper that I described to you, contracts are much more complicated, okay? But the literature has tended to kind of, sidestep that. And they're more complicated, and they're also designed to incentivize various behaviors by the parties involved in the contract. And actually, it was, this kind of work on designing contracts to incentivize agents when there are imperfect that was a lot of what Jean-Jacques' work was, and it's a lot of like important contributions that people at TSE have made following in his footsteps. Okay, so what's the issue that I think is an interesting issue that I think is, if we start to do empirical work, a bunch of the easy theory has like one-dimensional types, okay? But we want to do empirical work that is more realistic than that, ideally. And so it's natural to, in many cases, to work with, to think there are multidimensional types for the agents. And what a lot of this work wants to do, and this work is not in antitrust at all, really, right now, but if we figure it out more generally, and what the literature has sometimes done is asked, well, what if is there a better contract? And so you have a model that you estimate that estimates the primitives of demand and cost and all the rest, but then you want to solve for the optimal contract. And in these multidimensional settings, the literature hasn't really figured out how to do that, okay? So the example I was going to talk about is a paper by Marty Gaynor, that was in AER last year, which is about the reimbursement that Medicare, the public insurance, does in the US for dialysis patients for the drug that gets administered. Here. And so he's doing exactly the kind of analysis, like Medicare has a linear reimbursement policy, and the paper but he doesn't I'm not going to go into it given the time, but the paper doesn't quite get it right when it comes to like how to solve for the optimal contracts. And so that would be another example of a place where like, if we can figure out, how to do this, we're going to be able to analyze situations with richer contracts better. And that, like other foundational things in economics, can end up leading, in the case of antitrust, to better analyses of antitrust. Okay. I had such a nice figure, all these really nice figures, but I'll leave them here. Okay, so bottom line, conclusion. Theory and empirical work has had and will continue to have important implications and impacts on antitrust policy, number one. And then number two, budding, many open questions remain. Okay, and these can be ranging from very applied, that really are very antitrust specific, empirical work looking at certain antitrust practices that are of concern, theoretical work, but also foundational work. Like that seems like it's not as clear that how it impacts antitrust, but it will. So anyway, thanks.
Unfortunately, time is over. So just if there is any single urgent question, I will get it. Yeah. No urgent question. Okay. Yeah. Then let's stop here. I have one announcement. So. Invitation. So there are printed invitation over there for all TS colleagues, TS members. If you look at the TS inside of this week, then you can click and for the invitations on your phone, so you can show. Okay. Or the last option is beside the door there is a QR code, and then you can also get the invitation. Okay. Thank you very much.